Welcome to Strange Planet. For years, we were told the deadliest threat facing humanity was a virus. But what if the real danger wasn't the pathogen? What if it was the protocol? Tonight on Strange Planet, we're stepping into territory that mainstream media refuses to touch, a place where emergency powers, medical obedience, and bureaucratic language converge into something far darker than negligence. During the COVID era, and quietly continuing long after, thousands of vulnerable people inside the United Kingdom's National Health Service may not have died of COVID at all. They may have been sedated, dehydrated, isolated, and chemically silenced under the banner of care. What you're about to hear is not speculation. It's testimony, medical records, patterns too consistent to ignore. This is not about end-of-life dignity. This is about state power deciding who lives, who dies, and who is no longer worth saving. My first guest is Jacqui Deevoy, an investigative journalist who spent decades writing for the British mainstream press until she began asking the wrong questions. When COVID hit, Deevoy uncovered something chilling inside UK care homes and hospitals. Blanket do not resuscitate orders, families locked out, elderly patients denied treatment, and an explosive surge in the use of end-of-life drugs like midazolam and morphine administered to people who were not dying. What began as journalism became a reckoning when her own father died suddenly, following a routine paramedic visit. Since then, Deevoy has produced banned documentaries, built a network of whistleblowers and grieving families, and compiled what may be the most damning civilian record yet of involuntary euthanasia carried out under emergency authority. Her book, Murdered by the State, Involuntary Euthanasia in Plain Sight, documents 42 first-hand cases, story the state never wanted connected or remembered. And joining her is Richard Cox, author, researcher, and host of the Deep State Consciousness podcast, who helped edit the book and provides its forensic backbone. Cox isn't approaching this as an emotional story alone, but as a structural one. And by analyzing excess mortality data, World Health Organization timelines, NHS drug procurement records, and historical precedents like the Liverpool care pathway, Richard advances a deeply unsettling thesis that the so-called pandemic death wave may have been iatrogenic, caused not by a virus, but by medical policy itself. In other words, what if COVID didn't overwhelm hospitals? What if hospitals were weaponized by protocol? He argues that what unfolded was not chaos, but compliance, not panic, but process, and that once emergency powers normalized death decisions, they never fully went away. First of all, before we get started, let's welcome Jacqui and Richard. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Richard.
All right. Jacqui, I want to start with you because your book starts with your own story about your father's death in 2021. What first made you suspect something wasn't right, and then how did that lead to collecting these 42 family accounts?
Well, initially I wasn't inspired by my dad's death because he didn't die until 2021, and I didn't actually include my story in the book, although I might have touched on it in the intro. I wanted to focus on other people's stories, people who had solid evidence. I didn't have enough evidence to prove that my dad was actually murdered in his own home, even though I do believe he was. So I decided to focus instead on people who actually had the evidence, the medical records, the drug charts, and help give them a voice and get their stories heard.
And Richard, in your foreword, you look at excess deaths data from 2020. Can you explain in simple terms why you think it points to hospital protocols rather than just a virus?
Sure, and I will just say I'm drawing this research from people like Dr. Dennis Rancourt, Dr. Dini Rancourt in Canada, and Professor Norman Fenton, the statistician in the UK. So I don't believe you shouldn't trust the experts. I think the experts are great, but you just have to be careful and cross-examine them and all the rest, and you can come to some good sense of knowledge then. So the two, initially, me writing what was initially a report that section of became a forward was me addressing my own being dupedness in 2020, in that I did not believe at all that we should have lockdowns and compulsory this and compulsory anything. But when I saw the death rate go up, I thought, well, yeah, I guess there must be this novel virus. Unlike all the others, this one really is deadly. Look what's happening in Italy. And then I had to recognize at a later point that I'd made a fallacy there, that I'd made a correlation causation fallacy. And I thought, and I shouldn't have done that, right? Until I saw a big change and someone was saying there's a virus, or, oh, those two things must be connected. And I started to listen to arguments that spoke to the implausibility of that. Geographically, how you'd have a massive spike in the death rate in Spain, but really nothing in Portugal. A massive spike in northern Italy, but not the south, and not Slovenia just across the border. Nothing happening in Germany when Belgium and France are going mad with the death rates. And then on time too, even more implausibly, COVID is a virus that comes about, and people say they can find it way back in 2019 in water samples and everything. It does nothing, absolutely nothing. Italian excess mortality in February is a completely normal year, a little bit on the low side. And it does nothing until Dr. Tedros at the World Health Organization announces it and says to countries around the world, ready your hospitals. And it's the moment the lockdowns are instigated, the death rate shoots up. Okay, and I'm not saying it's people being told to be put in their homes, but it's the policies that were brought in. And that's when I started uncovering documents like Amnesty International in the UK figure this out early on, that as soon as the lockdowns were announced, in thinking this virus was on its way, 25,000 elderly people were evicted from hospitals in the UK and sent to care homes here, there and everywhere. Doctors wouldn't go in to see them. The families were banned. End-of-life medications were being prescribed over the phone. So Amnesty had it on the head as soon as August of 2020. The UK government essentially went to war with its old people, and they wrote this report as if expendable. And really, what I couldn't find for a long time was really the causal factor. What's the thing they're using? And that's when I found Jacqui's journalism and the interviews of people, and particularly the use of morphine and especially midazolam as being the factor there, the drug that's actually doing the killing.
Jacqui, many stories in the book mention midazolam. I'm not pronouncing that correctly, am I? How do you pronounce it? Midazolam?
I always pronounce it midazolam. Some people say midazolam, but
okay, midazolam. All right, midazolam and morphine being given to patients who weren't terminally ill. I mean, what are these drugs? Why do families believe they were used to hasten deaths?
Okay, well, in April 2020, there was a protocol brought in by the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, of the UK government, and it was a COVID protocol, and it was exactly the same as a protocol that had been abolished back in 2014 called Liverpool Care Pathway. That protocol involved the withdrawal of fluids and food, the withdrawal of essential medication, and the administration of benzodiazepine and opioid end-of-life drugs, as they're called, to make the person sedated and stop breathing and die. So this particular pathway, the Liverpool Care Pathway, was deemed inhumane and barbaric, and it was abolished in 2014. But then in April 2020, at the start of the so-called pandemic, they brought in this new protocol called NG163, which was identical to the Liverpool Care Pathway. So this was brought in kind of quite surreptitiously. Matt Hancock put this pathway to a panel of doctors and professors to ask whether it was a good protocol to use as a treatment for COVID. And all the doctors said no, it wasn't. And they wrote to the BMJ. There's an article that has been authored by Dr. Sam Amadzi, who's one of the world's leading palliative care specialists. And him, another professor, and 9 other doctors are all saying this pathway must not be used because it will kill people. Matt Hancock said, thanks very much, and implemented it anyway. So anyone who was aware of this was immediately suspicious, especially in the type of drugs that were being used. So midazolam is a benzodiazepine drug, a sedative. It's not a painkiller. And morphine is obviously an opioid and a painkiller. There are variations that have been used. You know, they use fentanyl sometimes instead of morphine, or they can use diazepam or lorazepam instead of midazolam. But the effect is the same. And the strange thing is, those two drugs, well, benzodiazepines and opioids should never be used together. Now, if you look in the British National Formulary of Drugs, it's very clear there. It states that those two drugs should never be used concomitantly. because they cause respiratory depression. So why on earth were they using those drugs as a COVID protocol, a COVID treatment, if COVID was a respiratory illness, which is what they claimed it was? So people were going into hospitals. They were initially, some were put on ventilators, some were immediately put on this protocol. Doctors and nurses at the time, a lot of them, the more awake, aware ones, were saying, what the hell, why are we using this? This is going to kill people. Some spoke out, were silenced immediately, lost their jobs. But most didn't, and they just followed orders and did as they were told, and ultimately killed a lot of people. So when this spike occurred, I never believed that there was a virus anyway. So some people do, some people don't. But I watched Event 201. I don't know if you saw it in October 2019. And I've been awake for a long time to a lot of the stuff that's been going on in the world ever since I was a child, because my dad was a bit of a conspiracy theorist even back in the 60s and 70s. So, I've grown up knowing that there's that no one landed on the moon, for example. Richard disagrees, but that's the fun of working with someone who has different views. But it's not something we've had a good discussion about yet, but we will in the future, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. When I saw Event 201, and then everything started up in 2020, I immediately thought, oh, they're doing it now. They're actually starting this whole rigmarole now, and I was quite surprised when it happened so suddenly and so soon. So I thought, oh, well, let's break. This is going to be fun. I'm going to feel the same way when we have the fake alien invasion. It's like, I'm so looking forward to that. But
just very quickly, for those not familiar, Event that you're speaking of 2.0 is, I believe, in October of 2019. Johns Hopkins Hospital, the Gates Foundation, just about every group imaginable that you could think might be involved in something like this, did this tabletop exercise, trying to, like a war game, anticipate what's going to happen when we have a major epidemic, some pathogen or something gets loose, and then lo and behold, as you say, 4 months later, October, November, December, January, February, bam, 2020, it hits. Like predictive programming, right?
Well, at that point, my dad was in a care home. He'd had a major stroke in 2019 in October, and he just needed some respite care. He needed help, so he went into a care home. I put him in there with the intention of him coming out. In fact, the day he went into the care home, I said to the manager, how long do you think he'll be here? I'll pick him up as soon as he starts getting better. And she said, oh, no, he won't be going home. And I said, yeah. So he was 76 at the time. He didn't have anything wrong with him apart from he'd had this stroke, which I knew he would recover from because he'd had a stroke before. And she said, oh, no, they don't go home. My dad even joked at the time. He said, you walk in the front door and you go out the back door in a box. And I said, yeah, well, that's not going to happen to you. And amazingly, it didn't, because a year later, I got him out of the care home because with the lockdowns, which were pretty shocking, really, for a lot of people, I didn't adhere to any of the nonsense and went wherever I liked and did whatever I liked because I'm a very contrary, naughty person. So my dad, who was terribly confused, as were all the other residents in the care home. Well, we had to do the window visits. My dad was like, what are you doing out there? Come in. And I said, the doors are all locked. And he was like, why are they locked? I said, I don't know, some stupid lockdown thing because of the virus. And we were speaking through an open window. I remember at one point, a carer came into the room and said, you can't have the window open. And I said, what, are you worried about the COVID's getting out and killing me, or the COVID's getting in and killing him? And she said, oh, don't be ridiculous. And she was trying to close the window, and I was wrestling with her going, no, leave. How am I supposed to speak to him if the window's shut? And she said, you can phone him. I said, he hasn't got a phone. He just lost it. I said, and that really makes it like a prison visit. And my dad was saying, I feel like a prisoner. And although we joked about it a bit, he actually got really depressed being in there. And he said, what have I done? Why am I imprisoned? Why can't you come in? This is madness. I said, don't worry, I'll get you out. So I got him out by just phoning the care home managers and just saying, I'm coming to get him tomorrow, wheel him out in his wheelchair, have him ready at 3:00. And if you don't, I'm going to take you to court for false imprisonment and violation of his and my human rights. And I thought, they're not going to go for that. But I went the next day, 3:00, they were outside with my dad with all his stuff, all smiles, saying, oh, make sure you come back at some point. And I was like, God, they'd be lucky. got him in the car, drove him back to his house, which I'd managed to keep for a whole year. It was a council house, and they wanted it back immediately. As soon as they'd heard he was in a care home, they were around straight away saying, we need the house back. And I'm like, well, he'll be back soon. And they're like, no, he won't. Nobody believed for a minute that he was going to come out of the care home. So, and I started looking into all the care home stuff when I first found out that he had a DNR put on him, a do not resuscitate order.
Wait a second. Who put that DNR on him?
There were blanket DNRs put on everyone in care homes at that time. It was actually, that was one of the first stories I sent to the mainstream media saying, do you realise that people have got DNRs put on them as soon as they go into care homes and hospitals? I spoke to some whistleblower doctors who told me that people coming to hospitals, they were counting anyone over 50 as elderly. So they were putting DNRs on elderly people, so anyone over 50. They were putting them on autistic children. They were putting them on people with mental health issues. One whistleblower doctor told me about a 30-year-old schizophrenic woman who came in to hospital for some treatment, and she had a DNR put on her. And no one was consulted about this. You'd only find out if you asked. I only found out accidentally that there was one on my dad, and that started a whole chain of events once I found that out.
Could you have it? Can anyone have it? Could they have it removed once they found out about it?
No, I tried. I got in touch with my dad's GP, and they said, no, everyone's got them on now. And I said, well, he doesn't want it on. I don't want it on. We need to get it removed. And they're like, oh, it's not that easy. So obviously, once I got him out of the care home, it wasn't in place anymore. But, and I made sure it wasn't when I got him home. I actually contacted his GP and said, now he's home. He doesn't have a DNR, does he? And I said, if it's on his file, take it off. And she said, yes, you'd do that. But actually, a year after I got him home, he had a visit from paramedics. His carer was worried because he was just having a bit of a coughing fit. He didn't have a cough, but he was probably choking on his toast or something, as he used to eat very fast. And she phoned me. I'm about an hour away from where he lived. And she said, what shall I do? And I said, well, if you call an ambulance just in case and give them, tell them to check his airways, maybe give him a bit of oxygen, but don't let them give him anything else. Don't let them inject him with anything. Because by this point, I'd made the film. I'd made the first film, which was called A Good Death. And that was produced with Iconic Media. And I was in the process of editing the film with the editor at the time when this was going on. So this was the 24th of September, 2021. And the paramedics called me when they got there. I told them not to give him anything, that I was on my way. I'd be there in an hour. And halfway up the motorway, I got a call saying that he was dead. So, and so my first question to the paramedic was, what did you give him? And they said, oh, we didn't give him anything. He just died. I said, died of what? And they said, well, he had cancer, didn't he? I said, no. They'd phoned his GP. His GP wasn't there. They spoke to a different doctor who told the paramedics that my dad had cancer, that he was terminally ill and was having palliative care. They'd got it wrong. He was reading someone else's notes, and something went wrong. And they acted on that. They said it was a best interest decision. And as far as they were concerned, it was in my dad's best interest to be dead if he was in that situation. So they were very young, these paramedics as well. I found out who they were. I know who they are. I know their names. I got all the notes, garbled notes from the ambulance service. They had to send me 3 lots of notes because they were just they had so many things wrong. They had the paramedics' names wrong. They had 6 paramedics were there on the first set of notes, and then 4 on the next set of notes. And they kept sending me all these notes. And at that point, I just thought, I'm going to report it to the police as a murder. So I reported it to the police. And this is an article I'm just writing now. Everyone around that time, 2020 and 2021, and later, 2022 as well, anyone who reported these kind of deaths, suspicious deaths or murders that they believed were murders, to the police were ignored. So the police I spoke to was the Metropolitan Police. They said they'd look into it, but they didn't really. And we toed and froed for 8 months, and then they said that they were closing the case because there was nothing to see. But we only discovered recently, of course, last year about Operation Tala, which was put into place in the UK on March the 10th, 2020. And that was an operation where the whole of the UK police forces were told not to look into any deaths, any reports of deaths involving the COVID vaccine or hospital protocols, especially NG163. There were 2 sections of this operation, and they were actually told not to investigate any of those.
That was in March of 2020, in anticipation of this, let's call it what it is, a cull.
A cull, yeah, exactly. So I've often called it that. So, of course, in April 2020, when there was the spike wasn't due to any killer virus. I mean, if there's a killer pathogen virus floating around in the air, we'd all be dead. And I don't believe there was a virus at all. So when I heard about these deaths, I thought, what's causing these deaths if there isn't a virus? And I pretty quickly found out. I started talking publicly about what was going on in care homes. I wrote a lot of care home stories at that time for the mainstream media. They were quite interested in what was going on for a short period of time, and then they kind of clamped down on any stories I sent them. There were so many stories. If you look up Daily Mail online and put my name and care homes, you'll see all the stories I wrote. There was a friend of mine went to visit her dad in a care home. She brought him some food, and she said to the person who answered the front door, "Can you just give this food to my dad?" And they said, "Yeah." And she said, "I'm just going to pop round and give him a wave through the window. He's on the ground floor." And the care home manager, assistant manager, said, "Oh, you're not allowed to do that anymore." And she said, "I'm not allowed to wave to my dad through a window." And she said, no, the rules have changed. That's now not allowed. So my friend went racing around to go and wave to him anyway. She thought, "I'm not listening to that." And the woman on the inside of the building ran through the building into her father's room and drew the curtains so she couldn't do it.
Because she wasn't supposed to see them treating her father horribly.
But yeah, I didn't even think of that. But it was just these ridiculous rules were put into place, and these ridiculous people followed them without asking any questions.
So the administering of morphine and midazolam, which hasten death. It's not a care process for COVID. We know that it is used to hasten death, and this was approved across the NHS by the health minister in the UK.
Yeah, the health secretary, Matt Hancock, now known as Midazolam Matt to everyone on social media. And of course, he denies it, and he's lied. A friend of mine has had several interactions with Matt in person, and Matt took him to court saying that this friend of mine had assaulted him, which he hadn't. I was in the court. And in June, I think it was June 23, Matt Hancock said he'd never heard of the drug midazolam, yet we've got him on video in April 17th, 2020 in the House of Commons talking about it, talking about how he was going to order a big supply of it. He ordered 2 years' supply in April 2020, and it was used up in 9 months. Now, midazolam is used for minor surgery. It's used for major epilepsy, and it's used in end-of-life care. So there were no minor surgeries being done at that time. The hospitals were shutting down to all that stuff. They weren't even doing cancer treatments or anything. So it wasn't used for that. And there wasn't a huge surge in epilepsy, as far as I know, in 2020. So where did it all go, and why did it all go so quickly? Well, I think I know where it went. I think it's in the bodies of the people who died from it and who are now cremated or buried.
Richard, although there are 42 cases in the stories in the book, any idea how many people across the UK died because of this cocktail of opioids and the sedatives and so forth? In other words, how many people were murdered?
Well, if the iatrogenic hypothesis is correct, and I think overwhelmingly the evidence points to that this can't be viral because of the geographical spread of the virus. It's not consistent with the virus, and over time, where it doesn't do anything until Tedros says ready hospitals, for those reasons, I can't see how it can be a virus. Then essentially anyone who's above the average would have been killed with midazolam, or maybe ventilators were used to greater or lesser extent in different areas, so maybe not absolutely exclusively midazolam, although people are given midazolam to go on ventilators. So I haven't added up the numbers actually, but there were weeks in March and April where excess death rate basically doubled. Over the normal expected. We're talking 10,000 excess deaths in a week there, and they would be 10,000 people who wouldn't have otherwise died apart from the drug intervention. And you can see it on there's a website which tracks the distribution of drugs in the UK. And initially, when I heard this iatrogenic hypothesis, it was Dr. Klaus Colin who proposed it, but he was pointing to hydroxychloroquine as being the drug that maybe was being used in excess. And I looked at that, and I looked at the trials, and I thought that it's correct, actually, that hydroxychloroquine was given out in toxic doses in certain drugs trials, okay? And you could speculate as the reason for that. Was it to demonize the drug? But the numbers were not sufficient to account for this massive leap in death. There weren't like vast numbers of prescriptions. And it's when I found Jacqui's work about the midazolam prescriptions, what you see is a big surge in midazolam prescriptions correlating perfectly, overlapping perfectly with the surge in excess deaths. You can just lie the graphs on top of each other. The same way you can in the winter, actually, where you see every winter in the UK and anywhere, you get a surge of deaths, and they peak around December, January time. And you also have a surge in antibiotic prescriptions corresponding with that for obvious reasons, except in 2020, 2021. So if you imagine there's a wave that peaks every winter, that peak is just missing in 2020, 2021. The antibiotic prescription has just collapsed in the UK because, and then there was a push going on internationally to limit the use of antibiotics and to use COVID as a way of doing that, because people feel they're being overly used. Whatever the truth of that is, they do seem to be useful. So if you take away the drugs that are being distributed to keep people alive from the secondary bacterial infections or whatever that they're getting, then again you're going to see this surge in infections. So I think it basically, if I'm correct about this, if Professor Fenton is correct about it and Professor Denis Rancourt in Canada, then it's 100% of the excess deaths caused by midazolam and the reduction of antibiotic use.
Wow. Jacqui, one chapter in the book describes a man pulling off his oxygen mask and begging to leave the hospital. How common were these kinds of desperate moments in the testimonies that you gathered?
That particular incident is incredibly common. I'd say, half the stories, there's scenes where people are pulling the masks off because they're uncomfortable and they don't want them. And the oxygen, sometimes they were being given too much oxygen and it was affecting their lungs detrimentally and causing all kinds of problems. So the people didn't want these masks on them. So many people said to their loved ones as well, please get me out of the hospital, that they're killing me. You know, this was quite a common thing. They knew in their gut that they were being murdered and that they were helpless to do anything about it. And of course, the relatives, who now feel terrible guilt, just said, oh, no, calm down, you'll be fine, you'll be out soon. And it's incredibly common. And the common threads going through so many stories, they really jump out. It was so easy to break down the first film I did, A Good Death, into categories because there were natural categories. Pushing up the numbers was about, the misattribution of deaths to COVID when they were actually iatrogenic deaths. And then we did a section as well about the nasty nurses, basically, because one thing that I would say 99% of the people I've spoken to, and I've spoken to a lot of people over the last 5.5 years, they say the nurses were just horrible. These nurses who are administering this treatment, this protocol, most of our nurses here in the UK are absolutely lovely. But during that period, I think there were some other types of nurses brought in. I think there were mercenaries. A lot of them were not English. And I'm not saying that in a racist way, but a lot of them weren't, from reports that I've heard. And a lot of them, they wouldn't make any eye contact with the family. They wouldn't speak sometimes. Some of them didn't have name badges on. Some of them just said the most cruel, sadistic things that are unbelievable, not the sort of things that a normal nurse would say. And even recently, I've heard reports of that. A friend of mine was in hospital just the week before last, having heart surgery. And she said during the day, the nurses were quite nice. But at night, she said these evil nurses would come in and she said they were just so cruel. They'd pull and push you around. She said they treated you like a bit of meat. They didn't have any compassion or empathy. And she was terrified every night. She managed to get out after 3 days because the first night she was in ICU, there were 5 deaths that she witnessed in one night. And she was lying there thinking, I'm next. All the machines beeping, all the defibrillators going on people. And that, from the story she told me, it sounded like the people were being killed with the defibrillators because the nurses would rush in, put the pads on the dying patient whose machine would be beeping, and the next thing they were dead. And she said the other very, very strange thing, so there's still a lot of strange things going in the hospital. Now, this is just the most recent account I've heard. She said the weirdest thing that night was that the bodies were, she said these two people would come in each time the death occurred. Within 2 or 3 minutes, they'd come into the ward. She'd hear them being zipped into a body bag and they'd be wheeled off. Now, that's very strange because usually the nurses have to clean up the patient. They have to get them prepared just in case family want to come. So I said to my friend, well, it was obviously that they knew these people had no family because they wouldn't do that. They was taken straight to the mortuary. And something horrendous that I've just been talking about this week to lots and lots of people, because I'm making a 4th documentary about organ donation, organ harvesting, and the controversy that surrounds brain death.
Which was made up in order to basically allow for the removal of organs from patients that were alive.
That's something that link is becoming very clear in Canada with the MAID system, that it is actually linked. So I've been looking, thinking, well, maybe it's linked here as well. And so I've gone back to my group, which now I've got a support group I set up in 2021, just to keep all the people that were telling these stories in one place. It's got 200 people in it because not everyone wants to. I've probably spoken to 1,000 people or more, but not everyone wants to join a group. Most people find it quite difficult, talking about what's happened, especially if it's quite, fresh in their mind. But a lot of terrible things are going on. And so we've kind of opened up a debate in the group about this, and it's led to some other discussions. So, for example, we're now talking about the fact that a lot of us didn't actually see the bodies of our loved ones. I heard my dad was dead. I never saw him.
What do you mean? There was no funeral? There was no visitation?
No, I never saw him. Oh, there was a funeral, but I didn't see him at the funeral because back during the COVID era, they did sealed coffins. There was a fear of contagion. So the stories, one of the stories in the book, this woman called Rosalind, her son was in a mental health facility and he died out of the blue. He wasn't an unhealthy person. They just suddenly told her he was dead. And she said at his funeral, she said he was 5'4", right? He was a small, light sort of guy, slim. And at the funeral, there was this huge coffin. And she spoke to the undertaker and said, why have you put him in such a huge coffin? And he said, I measured him up and he was 6'5", so we had to get one of the bigger coffins. And she was like, he wasn't 6'5", he was 5'4". And the coffin was so heavy because her husband was helping carry the coffin that they nearly dropped it at one point. And her husband used to work at a crematorium and said, I don't think it was him in there. I don't know what or who was in there. But again, they hadn't seen their son's body because the coffin had been sealed. And this is something that is now making me very, very suspicious, thinking they sealed the coffins. They didn't have to do that. Of course they didn't have to do that.
They sealed them because they were, retrieving their organs without permission?
We were first thinking maybe they took their organs and they didn't want the families to know. Maybe they're not, I'm thinking, invasion of the body snatchers, this, were they actually taking the whole bodies and just throwing some bricks in the coffin? I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. Wow. That's just new coming out this week. We're talking about it now. And it just sounds, most people, when I first started talking about this 5 years ago, obviously thought I was insane. I just did a survey on X the other day, asking basically, who believes it and who doesn't believe it. And 88% of people said they believe it because they know it's true. And I think 5 years ago, it would have been, a fraction of that would have said yes.
Right. This idea of hastening death and placing people on ventilators, which is basically once you're on the ventilator, the survival rate is negligible. I don't know how the NHS system works exactly, but I'm wondering, are there financial incentives for hospitals every time they put someone on a ventilator, or every time they mark someone as being infected with COVID? Any hospital incentives there? Richard, do you know?
Jacqui, actually, I think you do know more about this than I do, financial incentives.
Well, I know, strangely, it was easier to find out about the incentives in America, wasn't it? Whereas I do believe there are incentives here, but I don't know an awful lot about those incentives, but there definitely are. I don't know the exact amounts. I mean, there were incentives to doctors to administer the jabs. So there will definitely be incentives during COVID. Or what, I don't know exactly. But in America, it was there was one GP in the UK actually who said he was being paid to put COVID on the death certificates, whether the person had COVID or not. And that was one of the very early stories in 2020 I put to the mainstream media. I pitched a story about the misattribution of death to COVID. You know, it probably started when my dad's neighbour said that her friend's husband had just died and they'd put COVID on his death. This was in 2020, quite early. Had put COVID on the death certificate. She said it was really strange because he didn't die. He didn't have COVID. He had cancer. And that's when it all began. And then we started hearing more and more stories like this. A man, you know, is in a car crash and has COVID. I'm amazed they didn't put it on my dad's. But oddly, they put that my dad had carcinoma of the small intestine, which he didn't have. And then I had to fight with the doctors and the registry office, saying I didn't want that on his certificate because it wasn't true. And even though the doctor has said, no, we'd made a mistake, you know, and I'm saying, so what did he die of? They're like, we don't know. And I was fighting to get it changed, but then I'd organised the funeral by that point, and we had relatives coming over from Ireland, and they all started shouting at me saying, you know, I booked time off work, I booked a flight, you can't delay, because it was going to delay the funeral if I went down that. And I was so exhausted and tired, just tired really at that point, and felt under a huge amount of pressure that I just left it. So I decided not to focus, like I said earlier, on what happened to my dad, because I think maybe if I had gone down that path, I wouldn't have been able to focus on the other stuff. And because I knew at this point that there's people in my group have been fighting this sort of thing for 12, 13 years, and I know it can go on that long. And I've got one friend who's actually has taken it to court, and he's gone past the 5th inquest stage. It cost him over £100,000 to get to this point. Very, very hard to get a lawyer who's willing to take on the NHS and the UK government, and it's almost impossible to afford it. And the NHS and the government have got a bottomless pit of funds, whereas most people don't. And I've known people who started it, got to £20,000, run out of money, and had to stop. I mean, what the other side want is they want you to take them on, and then they can just drag it out for as long as they like, and hopefully at some point you'll either get exhausted, run out of money, or die. And that does happen in some of these long drawn out.
There was one lady that won in court who's featured in the book, and she won over the death of her father, and because the negligence was so obvious in terms of the denial of food and water and just the complete lack of care running up to it, that it was undeniable. But overwhelmingly, it is, as you say, just this process of being ground down, and in big part that's an inspiration for me to do the book. On the one hand, I want people as many people as possible to know this was the underpinning of the death spikes we saw in 2020, and it was caused by the lockdown. The lockdown was not a solution to it. So the next time some virus is announced to be coming from China or Timbuktu, we know what's going on, and there's enough people who in society who push back. But the other factor for me is on a personal level with the people. Their loved ones are killed in front of their eyes. The hospital don't want to know about it. The police won't investigate, and the coroner's office tell them to jog on. They don't care. Everyone just, it's COVID. So it's a get out of any investigation free card. And there's a reduction of their lives to being kind of meaningless. They saw them murdered in front of their eyes. They're direct eyewitnesses. You can see the level of drugs that were being put in, and nobody cares. And I think it's a big part of writing the book is just to give some small sense of justice and exposure to those stories, because the court system is just absolutely horrendous.
Well, Richard, your podcast, Deep State Consciousness, you cover spiritual and geopolitical themes. How did co-editing this book change your view on healthcare during the pandemic?
So I don't think that the whole COVID episode changed my views on anything, but it accentuated, right? So I knew the world was corrupt to a degree. I know the CIA is overthrowing something like 70 countries since the Cold War, and the US de facto has a global empire. And there's all these, they were managing the guys that did 9/11 before that happened, running around the United States. I know, so I have a very cynical view of the world, but I didn't think that it could run to this extent. I didn't think it could run to the massive levels of iatrogenic deaths being dressed up as a virus. I didn't think it could run to the lies that were told to manipulate the statistics around the other thing that we're not allowed to talk about on YouTube. So I don't know if I should say the word or not. So regarding healthcare, I always had a somewhat alternative view on that. And I always knew, of course, that how society maintains the strength of faith it does in the vaccination program, I can only attribute to some kind of religious impulse. The vaccines have replaced baptism as a kind of initiation, baptism into the kind of materialist science of the modern religion around that of the modern world, right? Because it just seems obvious to me, if you look at the death data, the death rates, they all declined prior to the introduction of the vaccine. So the measles vaccine was introduced at a time when the measles death rate was already down 97%. But what, you can go to Our World in Data and they'll show the graph and say, look, the measles rate declined by 95% after the vaccine was brought in, but they're excluding, they're starting after the 97% cut. So I was always very cynical in that way. But it accentuated, the world is so much more corrupt than I thought. It is so much more criminal. And people, in some say, I have to say it, I was disappointed by the level of gullibility I saw in the general population around me. I think I had my own little bubble where I thought people were more awake and cynical than they were. And even some people that were kind of cynical, I think the fear factor of COVID just got them, and they rallied behind the flag too and came out and applauded the nurses and meant it in their heart.
Fear is so powerful. It just overrides common sense, and skepticism doesn't stand a chance in the face of fear, unfortunately. I in my immediate circle, I shouldn't say immediate, but I know of half a dozen people who are my age or younger that suddenly came down with esophageal cancer. Esophageal cancer? Unheard of. Anyway, that's another show, I suppose. But let me go back to you, Jacqui, and how, what was it like going from writing for papers, you mentioned the Daily Mail, and then running up against this brick wall where they totally ignored your pitches on this story, and then now you're self-publishing this expose. What was that transition like?
It was gradual, really, because at the start they were taking my care home stories. They were taking my stories about crazy conspiracy theorists who thought COVID was a hoax. They took a couple of those, but when I started pushing this story, involuntary euthanasia in NHS facilities, they didn't like that at all. In fact, one editor said to me, well, it's not really that much of a story, is it? And I said, well, it is actually a huge story. And she said, well, we know it goes on in hospitals and care homes. We know that people are given a helping hand when they're very old or very ill. I said, right, firstly, even if you know that, it's still illegal, if it goes on. And secondly, the story is not just that people are being murdered in hospitals and care homes and hospices. It's that they're not terminally ill, and a lot of them aren't even elderly. It's happening across the board. People of all ages, young people as well as old. So it's not just, these stories aren't just a book full of tales about elderly parents and grandparents. They're stories of people, children and sons and daughters and husbands and wives and brothers and sisters. They're not all in their 90s, and none of them, I don't think any of them in this book were terminally ill. So they weren't at the end of their lives, that's for sure. So to be put on end of life pathway when you're not at the end of your life, even if you've only, there's nobody knows when someone else is going to die. The best doctor in the world does not have a clue when they can't say. But with these deaths, they were phoning the family and saying, they've only got an hour to go. And it's like, sorry, how do you know that? You only know when someone's going to die if you're killing them. That's pretty much it. I can't think of any other reason why you'd know.
Right. Yeah, like the person that predicts where the next fire is going to start probably said it. Families were reporting loved ones, you mentioned this earlier, being starved or dehydrated. under, what is it called? Nil by mouth? Is that the term? Nil by mouth rules?
Nil by mouth, as in nothing by mouth, NIL, yeah. Nil by mouth, yeah.
Now, was this part of this orchestrated call, or was this simply neglect? Unintentional neglect, if we can use that term.
It was intentional, and one of the recurring observations in most stories is when they did bring food round to these vulnerable people who were in hospital, they would put the food out of reach, so the patient couldn't get to the food. And a lot of them, when families did come in, they were saying, "I'm starving. Can you get me something to eat?" You know, and they're like, "Why aren't you eating the dead?" They say, "Oh, well, they put it over there by the end of the bed, and I can't reach it." And then they come and take it away, and then they report to the families, "Oh, you know, your mum's not eating. You know, she doesn't want to eat." And then the poor woman is starving in the bed. You know, and I mean, you can last for quite a long time without food. You can go weeks and months without food, but it's the water that's the problem. They stop giving them fluids, and they become dehydrated now. And to die from dehydration is the most horrible way to die. And yes, it is part of the protocol. It's identical to the Liverpool care pathway, and it's 100% deliberate.
Outside of, I don't know, Nazi Germany, or maybe the worst abuses in the Soviet Union or communist China, have you ever heard of anything like this happening, a government perpetrating this on its own people before? Richard, have you heard anything like this?
I would just say, I mean, you mentioned the examples, but as much as we're focusing on the UK, I do believe this is a story that went on around the world. And when I did writing on COVID a few years ago, and this is mentioned in the foreword, actually, I did find whether I got examples of this going on around Europe, where in Sweden, the deaths were all in the care homes. So that famously the country that didn't lock down, and they didn't have as sharp a spike of deaths as all the European countries. And by the end of the whole thing, they had some of the lowest deaths, but they had this initial wave in the care homes. And you have Swedish doctors there saying, "We just abandoned our old people and we pumped them full of drugs," and that was that. There's something called the C2C Journal in Canada that reported on it going on in Canada, and across New York there was this massive ventilator use. I was in touch with a nurse in Portugal, and she was explaining, nothing really happened here until they saw what happened in Spain, and then they panicked and started rolling out the protocols here. So I do think it was absolutely international. And in the UK, maybe because we have this history of the Liverpool care pathways, which came out in the media, there are more people who notice it when it's happening. But I think also, just from a hair's breadth, it's gotten good coverage here, in no small part due to Jacqui's efforts pushing it. And we also have the statisticians, two statisticians at Queen Mary's University in London, Professor Norman Fenton and Martin Neal, did statistical analysis of what was going on in the NHS, both with the deaths and then later on with the things we can't mention, and how the very clever analysis of, so I wouldn't have worked this out, how they used different classifications of what constituted someone who'd had the thing and not had the thing, to so you weren't considered to have had the thing until 3 weeks after you'd had it, and that gives you a window that if you die inside it, it's meant to be efficacy, right? If it doesn't kick in for 3 weeks, then you only start counting that after 3 weeks, and there's meant to be a separate data set kept for safety, but they were conflated. So you see this surge in deaths in the or can I say the word? I don't know if it's permissible to.
Yes, go ahead. They can.
Yes, in the unvaccinated. So you have the vaccines being distributed, and then there's a surge of death in the unvaccinated population in that age group, and it's then given out a decade lower, and a surge of death later than that, because they are really vaccinated. These are the vaccinated that are dying. So sorry, I'm rambling on here, but I do think that it's a global thing, and we have been, fortunate is the wrong word, but we have been in the UK fortunate with the level of exposure that it's gotten here, at least in alternative circles, if you go looking. And that's why, we really hope to break it into the mainstream press sometime. But another kind of learning for me in this, in working with Jacqui, is, again, I always knew that the press was kind of useless and money grabbing and controlled to some degree, but learning just how backstabbing, cutthroat, vicious it is when you from the backstage stories from Jacqui is like, that's a new level of education, unfortunately, for me in this too.
Yeah, I've been pitching those stories since 2020, and I'm still pitching the same story now. I actually had 2 face-to-face meetings with editors from the Daily Mail and from the Mail on Sunday in 2021 in May, and I brought lots of evidence with me, and I brought a man with me who was willing to share that evidence. And at first they were a bit dubious, and then after a couple of hours, they were saying, this is the biggest story ever. You know, this is front page news. This should be the headlines. And then they went away and then just slowly kind of went quiet. And this is what happened with the editors that I met. But even now, I think I probably pitched it a couple of weeks ago again to a few editors, just saying, are you ready to run this story? Because they're kind of edging towards certain, you know, the euthanasia stories. They're writing about things that are happening in Canada and other countries. And I'm saying, oh, look, you ran this story. Are you ready to run this story now that I've been pitching? Nothing has changed. I've been pitching it to you for 5 years. I've got more to bring. I've got 200 people who are willing to be interviewed for the paper and have their photos and put their names to the story. You know, are you interested? And now they just don't reply at all. If I pitched another story about a cat up a tree or something, they'd reply me.
Right. Jacqui, the book ends with resources for affected families. What advice would you give to listeners who suspect something similar happened to their loved ones, and how can they get involved?
Well, they can contact me. They can find me on X. I'm Jacqui Deevoy 1. Or they can email me, jacqui.deevoy@gmail.com. I can add them to my support group. Because the support group's been going for over 5 years now, well, almost 5 years, sorry. Some of the people in that group are experts on the law surrounding this, on hospital protocols, on everything to do with this terrible, terrible protocol. And they're all helping each other now in the group. Like I said, there's nearly 200 people in the group. We could have filled 3 volumes, you know, instantly, or made a much fatter book, because there are so many stories, and there are more and more stories coming in. I must say at a lesser rate than they were in the early days. But a recent one, a lady that joined, I found out that her father was killed at home as well. So, because there's only 3 or 4, I think, that I've come across, like my dad, where they're killed at home. Majority killed in hospitals, some killed in care homes, and a few that we've got reports of killed in hospices. So, but yeah, but there are so many more stories out there. I mean, there's thousands of people who obviously haven't come to me. So, and a lot of people who don't even know it happened. And what about all the people who don't have family who it's happened to? And I think they were probably the first to be targeted. And so what I would advise to people is if you're going into hospital, or if you've got a loved one's going into hospital, just keep a close watch, because it seems that if you do have family coming to visit or asking lots of questions, you're more likely to not survive. But having said that, a journalist friend of mine lost her mum Christmas, not last year, the one before. She was going in asking questions, but they still killed her mother. But it's just, and I said, because my dad knew what I was researching, and he knew about the first film that I was making. And he said, oh, then that's not going to happen to me, is it? And I said, of course it's not. How's it going to happen to you? All this stuff that I know, and you've got your carer with you 24/7. She won't open the door to anyone. Of course it's not going to happen to you, but they got him in the end.
Richard, I mentioned that this was a call, an orchestrated call. What was the ultimate purpose, do you suppose? Is it governments around the world decided, let's just get rid of the old and the feeble, and if we lose some young people as well, and reduce healthcare costs? Or what was the ultimate aim here, the motivation?
I'm very conservative about what I say on this. So I look down the rabbit hole of what's really going on in the world, and I can see so far, and then it disappears into darkness, okay? And I do think there are different motivations. So one way I look at it is, I'm sure the World Health Organization have tried this several times before with SARS and bird flu and the others. I'm sure they would love to have any one of them go global, and COVID is the one that did. Now, I totally appreciate other people might look at that differently and say, no, it's always been planned for COVID, and they might be right, okay? But I think there are different incentives at play. So I looked, for example, at the health ministry in Italy at the time, when Italy had a particularly left-wing government in 2020. And to them, they have these tie-ins with the Chinese health systems. I don't know why Italians have tie-ins with the Chinese health systems, but there they go, they do. And to them, COVID was more than just a virus to be fought. It was a way to reinvigorate the socialist project. It was a way to push back against this neoliberal individualism, which had gone too far, and say, yes, we can come together as a society, and we can show how collectivism works. We can show how we do need the state. We do need to put our greedy, selfish impulses aside. So that you don't question something if it goes along with what you want to believe. And then you have the guy in England who has been wrong about the Ferguson fellow who's been wrong about everything at all times in terms of his analysis. But you got to wonder, is it a kind of power trip for some people? Like, imagine being the guy that got to tell 60 million people they had to stay at home, while you're going around and seeing a mistress, which is what was happening here. It's crazy. Is that like an aphrodisiac? I don't know, right? And then beyond that, I don't doubt that at the international level, people know a lot more about this than me, but the World Economic Forum and such, I think that they're moving human capital around, and if they can get a pass in connected to vaccines, obviously there's massive pharmaceutical advantages to that. But I think it's really ultimately about the cannibalization of economies by huge corporations. Because if you look at the massive destruction of small businesses, I don't necessarily think that governments were trying to save money by killing off the old people, because COVID cost them so much. I think there's all these different incentives that there's a massive transference of wealth from small businesses that are being destroyed to massive corporations. So in the end, to famous quote, you'll own nothing and be happy. The corporations will own everything, and you won't be able to have your individual podcast because we'll have to go to Amazon.com to have our official approved podcast and this kind of thing. My friend will have to have his gardening business. You'll have to get that from Tesco's or Walmart and everyone. And I think that's what it's about. It's reshaping the human population in service of this global corporatist agenda. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Richard? Does that sound ballpark right?
No, I think you're right. It's multifaceted in terms of the motives, and the one that I offered up is probably too simplistic. And as you say, COVID was a huge cost center, to use a corporate term. So I think what you're saying makes absolute sense. Jacqui, are you at all hopeful that, during COVID, people were talking about we need a Nuremberg 2 trial. Are you at all hopeful that anyone, whether it's the health secretary, whether it's the pharmaceutical executives, whether it's hospital administrators, will be held accountable for mass murder?
I don't think the higher-ups will be held accountable, because they've been very aware of what they're doing every step of the way. So if anyone's going to be thrown under the bus, it will be the nurses. And when it comes to law, when it comes to murder, it's not the person who told you to go and shoot the man across the street. It's the person who fires the gun that is the one who gets punished. So, yeah, I do think it'll all come to light. And myself and other people are trying our hardest to bring it to the attention of the world. And I think it's working. And I can tell it's working because I'm so shadow banned on social media. It's unbelievable. So it's quite frustrating, but I am a dog with a bone. If you shut me down here, I'll pop up over here, and I'm kind of on it like almost 24 hours a day, just because that's the sort of annoying person I am. But it does take pretty much, you have to be on. You can rarely have a day off, because you're going to miss an opportunity, and I'm popping up all over the place. You see me on threads, newspaper threads, local paper threads, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, and just random people who happen to be random celebrities as well. I kind of look at some celebrity pages, and if they're mentioning anything vaguely relevant, I'll chime in, because obviously they've got a lot of views. But and I have got some quite well-known people now asking questions, and one very well-known person here in the UK, she does a lot of TV. She said she would actually buy a copy of the book and read it, and everyone was saying, wow. And she's got 700,000 followers, and she does lots of high-profile TV stuff. And she said she'll have a look at it, and I said thank you very much. Whether she has or not, I don't know. But some other journalists, mainstream journalists, have said to me, yeah, I'll have a look at your film, or I'll have a look at your book. And then they just go deadly quiet, or blocked me. Other journalists have been known to block. 2 mainstream journalists have blocked me without saying why, and for no obvious reason apart from the fact that I've said, do you want to look at my film, or do you want to have a look at my book? And then I get shut down. So yeah, that says a lot. I find it quite amusing, really, because I just, like I said, I'll just pop. I'm like, that whack-a-mole. I'm like, that is, whack me down here. I'll pop up over there. So yeah, I'm not going to stop. At one point, I thought I would, and at tired moments, I think, okay, I've got to stop this now. It's getting ridiculous. It's exhausting. And then the next day, I think, oh, I feel all right today, and I carry on. So yeah, I think I'll be doing it forever.
Murdered by the State Involuntary Euthanasia in Plain Sight. How do we get a copy?
Available in lots of formats, and one very interesting format that we've done is an audiobook. It's not like your average audiobook, because most of the stories are read out by the actual people who've told the stories, which was quite a hard thing to put together, but we did it in the end. And the people who couldn't read out their stories for practical or emotional reasons, we got actors to step in and read them for them. But the majority of the stories are read on the audiobook by the actual people who've lost loved ones to involuntary euthanasia.
And that's a haunting effect. We have people saying they're listening to, one every few days or something, because it's all they can emotionally cope with. I'm very glad that we did ultimately make the decision to do that, because it's not like any other audiobook you've heard. May I just say also, yes, on the website that Jacqui will give the link to, there's the option for a physical paperback, hardback book, but there's also the option to download a PDF for a donation of any amount. Okay, so anyone, any kind of, if having hardship or whatever, the PDF can be a donation of $0. We really appreciate the donations, because there are, as Jacqui said, 2 more volumes we could start work on today, and 1,000,001 other things. And we do feel we're in a battle. And as regards pessimism and optimism, I'm sincerely hopeful, and I really believe we can get this knowledge to enough people to stop lockdown society and a similar call happening in the future. And I think right now, people are very wedded to the COVID narrative still, but not as wedded as they were in 2021 and 22. And I do think that a lot of people have created a record that also people in the future will look back and be able to understand what happened in 2020 in a way that when I look back to the Spanish flu, these days, I don't think it was a virus, right? Mm-hmm. But I can't say 100% what happened there. I think we're creating a record that people in the future will know, and people now will know not to let it happen again.
And the Deep State Consciousness podcast, Richard, how do we listen?
Oh, deepstateconsciousness.com. That has links. There's also a link to the Murder by the State work on there, and a link to my variety of other works. It has a link to a book on called Measuring the Mandates. That's a free download, and that goes through, and it's really looking at COVID through an anarchist lens, asking the state to justify its actions on the lockdowns, on the masking, on was there even a virus to begin with, and measuring, saying, okay, how you told us we need to do all these things. How would we measure whether they were successful or not? And you can probably guess what conclusions I drew there. But yeah, it's Measuring the Mandate on the deepstateconsciousness.com.
Jacqui and Richard, thank you so much. And thank you for all the work that you're doing, and appreciate the time you spent with me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.